One group of outcome measures that the WWC treats differently is standardized tests. Many education studies use standardized tests to estimate the impact of an intervention. A standardized test is an assessment given to all test takers using the same set of procedures. In most cases, standardized tests have established administration and scoring procedures. Generally, the measure reports scores in relation to a normed sample so that people can compare scores from different settings. The WWC typically assumes that standardized tests demonstrate face validity and reliability. Why? We assume they have face validity because test developers design standardized tests to measure a specified set of concepts. Therefore, by definition, the test scores have face validity. And why do we assume reliability? Standardized tests have established administration and scoring procedures. Test developers typically examine items to ensure that combining the items into a scale score produces a reliable resulting score. So, if a study uses a standardized test and administers and scores the test according to the procedures outlined by the test developer, the WWC assumes that the measure meets face validity and reliability requirements. Using our target image to illustrate this point, the WWC assumes that standardized tests are consistently close to the bullseye, demonstrating both face validity and reliability. How can reviewers recognize a standardized test? There are several things to look for, any one of which will indicate that the WWC considers the outcome measure standardized. If the measure has a trademark or a reputable testing organization developed it, the WWC considers it standardized. The WWC also considers measures with technical manuals to be standardized. Well-known measures for the field and those with established scale scores are also typically standardized tests. Finally, the WWC considers state and district achievement tests to be standardized measures. However, according to the WWC, outcome measures developed by the researchers of the study are not standardized tests because these measures typically do not have any of the properties of standardized assessments. There are a few other things to bear in mind when deciding whether or not an outcome measure is standardized. First, the measure used in the study must be an established scale or subscale, not just a researcher's selection of items from the test. For example, the developer of the Woodcock-Johnson 3, WJ3, assessment has identified several subscales, including the WJ3 calculations, WJ3 letter-word identification, and WJ3 passage comprehension subscales. If the study uses the WJ3 assessment, then it needs to use the assessment in its entirety or use one or more of the subscales in their entirety. Validity and reliability have been established for the full assessment and the subscales, but not for a portion of items in one or more of the subscales selected by a researcher. It is also acceptable to combine two established subscales, as long as the study uses both subscales in their entirety. A second issue that affects whether the WWC considers a test standardized relates to the administration of the measure. Even if a standardized test has established administration procedures, researchers may sometimes deviate from those procedures when administering the measure. This is a concern because the developer of the measure determined the properties based upon specific established procedures. If researchers deviate from those procedures, it may affect the validity and reliability of the measure. If the study contains evidence that the researchers did not follow the established administration procedures, the WWC does not consider the measure standardized. Let's discuss a few examples of issues that may raise concerns about standardized tests. In the first example, the researcher is studying low-achieving first-grade students. Because the students are low-achieving, the researcher decides to use a test designed for kindergartners. This is a concern because the developers have not established that the test is appropriate for measuring the outcomes of first-grade students. In the second example, the developer designed a measure for one-on-one test administration, but researchers administered it in small groups for their study. This is a concern because the administration of the outcome measure deviates from the approach the developer established. And finally, in the third example, a research team uses a different threshold to calculate scores for a measure. In this example, the developer requires valid responses for 95% of items to generate a score, but the research team calculated scores when only 90% of the items had valid responses. This goes against the developer's established scoring procedures.